So Mozart's name is
Theophilus,
which means the same thing as Amadeus. Okay, single mistake pointed out, let's just move on, shall we? Mozart tells the emperor and the courtiers about the abduction from the seraglio, which is set in a harem. That's what a seraglio is apparently. As expected, this horrifies the courtiers, but what I like about Orsini's reaction is that he seems less concerned about the subject matter of the libretto and more the language it's in.
In a seraglio.
You mean in Turkey?
Yes, exactly.
Then why especially does it have to be in German?
Further demonstrating his stubbornness about Italian operas. And Bono's face again. Them two are almost always shown in a two-shot right next to each other, like Jay and Silent Bob. They both come as one package. Like a comedy duo, it's fascinating. Conversation is brought back to the subject matter. Mozart tries to prove that this opera is worth showing. He appeals to the German in the emperor by saying it has proper German virtues. He has already convinced the emperor at this point, and while he is an agreeable person, the way Mozart is trying to appeal to the emperor is far more sincere than how the courtiers would do it. Salieri feels threatened by this new, unique idea, and begins to try to make the emperor feel lesser about the idea of a German opera. This whole back and forth about the German versus Italian opera argument is a metaphor for an overwhelming fear of change on Salieri's part, as he can see that Mozart is more destined for success, though he doesn't deserve it. It's a mind battle between this conservative composer simply trying to please God, and this liberated artist who simply wants to please everybody else. And think about it like this, if all operas started becoming German, what of Italy would Salieri have left to hold on to? So after Mozart explains that love is a German virtue, Salieri immediately sees an opportunity for defeat.
Of course, in Italy we know nothing about love.
It's funny how Salieri decided to say this considering his celibacy, but perhaps one of the funniest moments in this film is what our main man Bono does.
Oh, love! Well, of course, in Italy we know nothing about love.
I love how that laugh carries on just a bit longer than you'd expect.
She's a bit of all right.
Mozart manages to convince the emperor to let it be German. The emperor then gives Mozart music Salieri made for him, and he says he already has it in his head. They ask him to prove it.
The rest is just the same, isn't it? It doesn't really work, does it?
If you remember what I said in part 2, this is the chord that was played when Mozart was kept out of the room. The one chord Salieri owned that Mozart decided wasn't working, which led to the change, which led to Salieri's increased jealousy. Now I need to use this time to argue against what Charles Cornell said about this line.
The rest is just the same, isn't it?
A little bit over-dramatized, but
It doesn't really work, does it?
I mean, it works pretty well.
I really don't think Mozart was saying that doesn't really work, as in that goes against the rules of music theory or that it sounds terrible. And I think maybe Charles Cornell was confused about this scene in general. As you'll come to see, he was quite misinformed and made some assumptions. I like Charles Cornell, don't get me wrong, but it's not surprising he would say stuff like this, because if you watch when YMS debunked the things Charles Cornell said about Yoko Kanno's plagiarism, you'll see that clearly Charles did not do any research into the matter and gave his own preconceived opinion based on 2 seconds of a song.
And I was kind of annoyed to come across accusations of her stealing stuff. The particular video that everybody was pointing to is like, ooh, this is the proof that she stole all this stuff. And I'm like, as usual, when there's accusations like this, it's probably from somebody who doesn't really know what they're talking about very much. And it's just like, don't put this thing that I found that came before it. I knew about this before.
Wanna take you on a roller coaster. Then the next part comes in, and then drums, right? Yep, same cue, and drums. And then it's literally identical in structure. A lot of the music is in my head. We both write music. That's fine. You're probably a better musician. I would argue that I'm much more knowledgeable than you when it comes to copyright infringement, fair use, and plagiarism.
Before it, I knew about this before it.
This is his representation of the other side of the argument, and this caused someone to say he's a jazz pianist and he's done his research. Like, what the fuck? He's not even engaging with the argument. That's not doing your research. You're not even engaging.
Anyway, I know this seems like it doesn't relate, but just bear with me. So really, when Mozart says that doesn't really work, it seems clear to me he's simply saying that's not how I would compose this part, because you can do something a lot better. So why not do that better thing? And to be honest, I don't think it really
pretty well.
works. Salieri's march is in major, and then all of a sudden there's one minor chord in the middle of a phrase. It does sound a bit out of place. And as we see in this scene, Mozart changes it to continue to stay in major, and he actually accentuates that major chord by doing a sort of rising arpeggio.
Shouldn't it be a bit more? Or this? This? Yes.
Of course it sounds better, and the reason why is because this piece is from Mozart's Marriage of Figaro opera, meaning they actually worked backwards from that piece and simplified it, added that minor chord to make it sound like something Salieri might do, especially with such a short deadline. So after Mozart plays the melody a few times, he then repeats the tune from the beginning, adding in essentially what is the vocal melody of the piece from the opera. Charles Cornell said this.
This is where it becomes much less like, oh my god, that's so crazy, because all he's doing is basically theme and variations, which is, you can pretty much improvise.
And sure, he's correct with that, but like, you know, this is a Mozart melody. This isn't just some average variation. This is specifically the melody Mozart chose to write, and I've listened to it a lot. I don't see how you could make any sort of different variation of a melody on top of those chords and have it sound as good as what the actual Mozart wrote for that opera.
That's a terrible example, but
anyway, back to the scene because I need to immerse you in this moment right here. This has to be my favourite shot of possibly the whole movie. Starting from a medium wide, Salieri looks around checking if other people are as blown away as him. He suddenly looks ashamed that this piece has been improved so much in so little time. We get closer to him as he fixates on Mozart and the piano. You see him freeze. This shot represents his fully formed jealousy that has now officially taken over his life. And to contrast, we cut immediately from Salieri's serious face to Mozart's annoying SpongeBob smile as he continues to play this amazing piece with absolutely no effort. Ugh, you know, great scene, great scene. The scene cuts from Mozart's happy laugh to Salieri's sad frown as he sarcastically thanks God. Seeing the crucifix to possibly highlight his own pain, feeling conflicted by his relationship with God at this point.
All I ever wanted was to sing to God. He gave me that longing. And then made me mute. Why? Tell me that.
Immediately, Madame Cavalieri comes in for her session with Salieri. You'll notice she is wearing bright and whimsical colours, sort of sweet, as if she's being associated with a dessert. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then watch the first two parts of my analysis. We see that Salieri has a particular liking to Madame Cavalieri through the interaction that both seems casual and loving on his end. But you'll notice throughout the scene that the camera remains pretty distant from both of them, a way to dismiss all possibility of mutual intimate feelings throughout the cinematography.
Well, I heard you met Herr Mozart.
News travels fast in Vienna.
Salieri already feels as though Mozart has stolen her from him, and through the conversation we see Salieri, as usual, try to manipulate her into saying no to doing Mozart's new opera.
Do you know where it's set, my dear? A brothel.
Oh.
Salieri wants to cut the conversation short, but Madame Cavalieri asks,
What does he look like?
Mozart? You might be disappointed.
Why?
Looks and talent don't always go together, Katharina.
Yet more manipulation from Salieri.
Looks don't concern me, maestro. Only talent interests a woman of taste.
She said something that has now hurt Salieri, as he feels he won't be able to surpass Mozart's talent. Now, before we get to the next scene, I need to point out my own personal interpretation of the character Madame Cavalieri. I believe she is a personified representation of the art, the music, the passion, and the desire to fulfill a fantasy, the dream of immortal legacy, something Mozart had already grasped at, that Salieri can't get. So the scene ends with an overwhelming zoom in and a quick cut to the performance of the opera. This is something Milos Forman did in his other movie Man on the Moon.
And the line goes...
Roar! And the dog goes, and the cat goes.
Yeah,
If you've seen Nostalgia Critic's video on Man on the Moon, you probably learned that between the cut from Andy Kaufman's childhood to the start of his comedy career, the writers forgot to mention the very biopic-worthy events of his life leading up to it. It just kind of cuts to him already being a misunderstood comedian. I understand it works as a sort of humorous way of telling us, look, he sung nursery rhymes as a kid and then did it as a living as an adult. But that's sort of all it does. It highlights his childlike wonder, but it skips the long journey it took him to get back to that place of childlike wonder. Whereas in Amadeus, this long time jump works not just for the story, but it works in that you can feel the quick passage of time. The way Cavalieri's singing perfectly morphs from something Salieri is getting her to play to something Mozart wrote. All of a sudden, these beautiful melodies Salieri could only dream of writing. All of a sudden, what Salieri wants is out of reach. All of a sudden, Mozart's opera has already been written, rehearsed, and realized, and it's as if Salieri slept through all of it in such a short time. At this moment, Salieri feels as though he has no control over his life and goals anymore. So the opera plays for a while, allowing us to bask in the beauty of the music. Notice we are now more far away from Madame Cavalieri than in the last scene. I shouldn't have to explain what that means. When we see Salieri, it cuts to exactly what his view of the stage is, much like the beginning when he was at the church. It's this wide view. Obviously when you're in a theatre, that angle is fine because your eyes can see a bit better than real life, but on film, seeing this wide angle makes everything vague. It makes her face unrecognizable. Had it been edited with medium shots of her singing, like a normal film, we wouldn't have been able to experience the true distance Salieri feels from this woman he loves. As Salieri recalls this memory, we cut in closer to Mozart, and I believe the following shots convey something very psychological. You see, Salieri believes Mozart must have slept with Madame Cavalieri, but to be honest, there is no evidence of this. As a viewer, we can only assume he did or he didn't. This is one of those clever examples of ambiguity being used. And I really like how throughout the film there are a few more unanswered questions that we can have our own opinions of, rather than telling an objective story. It leaves some things hidden to make us as viewers decide what we want to think is happening. I don't know, maybe there is only one way to see this story and I'm just stupid and I don't understand it, but yeah, that's how I feel about it. But back to the point I was making. It seems as though this sequence of shots right here does not necessarily represent the truth, but represents Salieri's truth, what he thinks has happened. The way it cuts in closer to Mozart and Madame Cavalieri is basically saying that, well, although Salieri can't see them very clearly, both literally and metaphorically, his mind is filling in the gaps with his own assumptions, and so this is what he sees. Now this hurt me, break me, kill me part could have a few interpretations. These lyrics could either represent Salieri's inner feelings, the fact that Mozart may have slept with her is hurting him, breaking him, killing him. The other interpretation is that hurting, breaking, killing is what Salieri wants to do to Mozart and maybe even Cavalieri. As soon after this, Salieri says this:
I began to know really violent thoughts.
It's also a little bit of insight into how Salieri sees Mozart by acknowledging how Mozart is smiling through those violent lyrics. Salieri's suspicions seem truer and truer as the opera continues. We then get to separate ourselves from Salieri just to enjoy the music, which is something we deserve, guys. It may be about Salieri, but we can still enjoy some Mozart just because, okay? We get to see a wide shot of the Emperor and we can vaguely see a small smile on his face, but it's not quite clear what he thinks, which is why it's a wide shot. To be honest, I think the Emperor somewhat doesn't know what to think and lets his courtiers decide his opinions for him. But what's this? Bono is separated from his partner. No! I think this just adds to the whole consensus between the Italians that German opera is just unfavourable to Italian opera, and seeing the Emperor's kind of smiling face is so confusing to him. Mozart continues to be very explicitly happy about his music and about what he has created. When we see Mozart conducting his following opera, he seems more refined, more toned down, and when we see him conducting Don Giovanni, he is broken and angry. I have nothing to say about that right now, but I just wanted to note the evolution of this character in these paralleling shots. The opera finishes and the Emperor comes on stage.
Brava, madame! You are an ornament to our stage.
Your Majesty.
Well, Herr Mozart, a good effort. You have shown us something quite new tonight.
It is new.
Of course, now and then, just now and then, it seemed a touch, how shall one say, Director?
Too many notes, Your Majesty.
Exactly. Very well put. Too many notes.
You'll see how again, this isn't straight from the Emperor's mouth, it's from Orsini Rosenberg's. But I do also believe this scene is also being used as a way to highlight how Mozart was ahead of his time, and at this point the Emperor had probably only heard music like Salieri and Bach and Handel. And while Bach and Handel were definitely great composers, by listening to all of them, Bach to Bach, so to speak, you can definitely see how one from this time period may perceive Mozart's music as a bit more overwhelming than the others. And obviously if you look at the big picture, Bach is clearly more ahead of his time, seeming as he essentially influenced the very foundations of what became modern pop. But Mozart was still one of the first to make something that sounded genuinely quite new. Salieri agrees with the Emperor twofold: one, to please the Emperor, two, to help destroy Mozart, but that should be obvious. So when the Emperor tells him his thought, Mozart is, as expected, explicit about his disagreement, as he doesn't take criticism very well. Something me and him have in common. Except, you know, that criticism just isn't valid. It's opinion, but it's not anything Mozart ever needed to work on. Had he cut the notes down, his music would have been bland and boring. I should hope this is what most people agree with, but I don't know. Some people just think all criticism is valid, and I think sometimes it's okay to point out when it isn't valid. Did this get too personal? Okay, I'll move on. We now get to see another little window into Mozart's life. So Constanza and her mother come onto the stage, and when Caterina Cavalieri hears of their marriage, she storms off. Now, if you'd seen my Christmas Carol video, you would have seen this part. And this actually reminds me of a point I'm going to be making in my Amadeus analysis. Someone said that a scene should have been cut. And my thing is, why should a scene be cut just because the information has already been delivered? Sometimes scenes exist to drive a point home, to let you sit in it, to let you just chill a bit, a little break from focusing too much on the story. Imagine if 2001 A Space Odyssey, like there are many shots in 2001 A Space Odyssey that could be cut, and you would still get the same amount of information from the movie. But the reason they aren't cut is for the experience. It's to let you experience what's happening. So I just don't think that's a good point to ever make with movies, especially if the scene is good. Well, you're in luck, because now that's being covered. I mean, I've already made the point, but I'm just going to explain further. One Fatal Flaw had this to say.
Caterina, upon hearing this, storms off stage. Now in the director's cut, there is an added scene with both Salieri and Mozart speaking with Caterina in her dressing room. She is extremely short and hostile towards Mozart, and by the end of the scene, Salieri realizes that the two of them have had an affair. But in the theatrical cut, the entire scene is cut, and right after Caterina stomps off stage, that is when Salieri puts two and two together and realizes they have had an affair. The same goal is accomplished, and several minutes spent on a redundant scene is saved. With that said, I would actually argue that the theatrical cut is superior to the director's cut, as it trims the fat and leaves it to the bare essentials.
So obviously, as someone who's only seen the director's cut, I see no reason why any of the scenes should be cut. I enjoy all of it, and as I said before, the purpose of a scene does not only have to exist for exposition. That's stupid. And I completely understand what he's saying, but I don't think this added scene loses something. It simply changes the context a bit. If you'll notice in this scene, there are pretty much no close-up reaction shots of Salieri. So I could see why it'd be a better decision to leave in this backstage scene, because this scene has that crucial close-up of Salieri. The second reason I think it works is I think as a viewer, this extra scene makes it easier as a viewer to remember this crucial moment. Caterina is also shot in only medium and wide shots just like Salieri, because this scene has momentarily pulled away from Salieri's plot to focus on Mozart and his personal life, which is why we're so intensely introduced to Constanza's mother. I'd say as a first-time viewer, watching this scene in the theatrical cut that just cuts to Salieri saying "I knew he'd had her" might just go over people's heads because they're still concerned about the mother who just fainted, and they're still focused on Mozart and the Emperor's interaction. It's that reason that I think the backstage scene is completely necessary. Not to mention we get more screen time of Cavalieri, this funny, loud, dramatic, expressive woman who carries both this scene and this one. It just drives the point home, reminding us that Cavalieri is in love with Mozart and that she has been affected by the events of the previous scene. And it allows us a bit more time to wonder if Mozart had actually slept with her or not, which is the same experience Salieri was having. But seriously, sometimes scenes don't just exist for getting a point across. Sometimes you need extra focus on a certain concept to fully reel the audience in, or it could go over their heads. The second act of 2001 A Space Odyssey is supposed to feel slow and boring to make you feel the experience of being isolated and alone and bored, with no control and no entertainment. Not only does it create an uncomfortable environment for the audience, but it also makes HAL 9000 more scary, especially when you realize you have no one to contact except a machine that's in control of your whole livelihood. Anyway, with Salieri, to me it seems he's going through a 4-stage realization. 1. The realization that Cagliari has the hots for Mozart. 2. The realization that the two of them may have something going on. 3. The realization that Cavalieri and Mozart may have slept together. And 4. The confirmation that they definitely did, at least in Salieri's eyes. This backstage scene being cut just completely cuts short the gradual heartbreak Salieri's experiencing. I hope this has been a good enough explanation. One fatal flaw, you just got served. We're back to the present as Salieri begins questioning God about what had happened. The camera is very intimate with Salieri and the priest, as it's now not just Salieri's life which is the subject of the conversation. Now the priest is beginning to question his own manner of thinking when it comes to God. It's clear by this face he has no answer for what Salieri is saying. The priest's character is being developed without him even saying a word. We then find Salieri praying for Mozart to go back to Salzburg, which coincidentally cuts to the Archbishop of Salzburg responding to Mozart's father's request to bring him back. This both gives us some kind of in-story evidence that perhaps God really does exist, and is actually trying to grant Salieri's request. But what's interesting here is that maybe we are potentially being told to see Mozart's father as God, or at least some sort of symbol for a puppeteer. Perhaps God created Mozart's father so that he could instill extravagant talent into his child. At this point in time, I feel like there is something on the tip of my tongue that brings this all together, but I just can't quite say what it is yet. I just think it's interesting to make some sort of comparison between Mozart and his father and Jesus and God. Perhaps it's something to do with Salieri's viewpoint. Leopold, that's Mozart's father, then manages to get the Archbishop to agree to let him go to Vienna to try and get Mozart back. Then this piece from Mozart's Mass in C minor, which is one of my favourite pieces, begins playing. And in Harmony Korine style, we hear a voiceover of Leopold's voice message. Letter to Mozart.
I write to you with urgent news. I'm coming to Vienna. Take no further steps towards marriage until we meet. As you honor the father who has devoted his entire life to yours, do as I bid and await my coming.
I think we found ourselves here. We finally got to see some other parts of the world. We saw some beautiful things here.
As the voiceover ends with him telling Mozart not to get married just yet, it cuts to Mozart getting married. This piece is so good, I heard it live once, ugh. This piece comes back later and it's my favourite scene, way better than the show-off scenes where I have no idea how I'm going to intro that yet. I wanted to look up what the lyrics are in this piece that's playing, and at this point the lyrics translate to Lord have mercy upon us, Christ have mercy upon us. The music is domineering, as if it's coming from Mozart's father to accommodate the voiceover. It's as if he's watching over Mozart, disappointed that he had the wedding before his arrival. Mozart is clearly an unorganized person who likely has ADHD, so it's obvious from this film that he didn't actually get round to reading the letter, as when he arrives, Mozart seems completely surprised, which is why he got married without waiting. I like how it's not outright told to us with exposition that he didn't read the letter, but we can very easily make that assumption. Yet more clever writing that manages to develop the character smoothly and faintly. At the end of this shot, Leopold crumples up the paper, and the noise from the paper appears to startle some random deer. This feels like another hint that perhaps he is being paralleled with God. He is disappointed with Mozart and his anger causes a disruption in nature. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it. It's just a really nice transition to the next scene, which will be discussed in part 4.